I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. Wow. Okay, let's just dive right into this, guys. That is the strikingly famous and frankly deeply unsettling confession that kicks off our text today. We are instantly hooked, right? Dragged straight into the mind of a flawed, utterly fascinating narrator who literally holds nothing back. Welcome, everyone, to today's Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you, focused learners, here as we set the stage for a totally mind-bending critique of 19th century utopianism. We're going to explore the absolute paradox of human nature, all through the eyes of one of literature's most intensely analytical anti-heroes.
So, looking at the source material here, Fyodor Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, published back in the mid-19th century. This is a foundational existential text. It absolutely shatters the illusions of its time, specifically this popular idea that human beings are these perfectly rational, easily predictable creatures who are naturally going to build a flawless utopian society. Spoiler alert, Dostoevsky strongly disagrees. Now, to navigate his chaotic mind, here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll meet the underground man. Second, we look at the disease of consciousness. Third, the illusion of rationality. Fourth, smashing the stone wall. And finally, we'll wrap up with the value of suffering. Let's get right into it. All right, Section 1, Meet the Underground Man, a portrait of spite and contradiction.
So, who is this guy? Our narrator is a 40-year-old retired government official, and he's living in this wretched, horrid little room on the outskirts of Petersburg. He tells us point blank that he was a spiteful official. When people came to him for help, he admits he took this agonizing, intense enjoyment in acting incredibly rudely to them, grinding his teeth, finding absolute pleasure in making people miserable out of pure, unadulterated spite. But here's the catch. He also confesses he couldn't even become truly wicked. He was basically just amusing himself, completely paralyzed by all these swarming, contradictory thoughts in his own head.
Moving on to Section 2, the disease of consciousness, or as I like to think of it, the absolute paralysis of overthinking. Now, the underground man drops this massive claim on us. I swear, gentlemen, that to be too conscious is an illness, a real thoroughgoing illness. He genuinely believes that having even a fraction of the self-awareness of an educated person in his time is a literal curse. To him, hyperconsciousness leads straight to complete inertia. It's like you think so much about every single action, every motive, the infinite chain of causes and effects that you just end up doing absolutely nothing at all. Check out this brilliant visual metaphor he uses. On one hand, you have the direct man of action. This guy dashes straight for his goals like an infuriated bull with its horns down. He doesn't overthink, he just acts, mostly because he fundamentally doesn't question himself. But on the other side, we have the man of acute consciousness, which is how our narrator sees himself. Not as a man, but as this overly analytical, hyper-aware mouse. And when this mouse gets insulted, it doesn't fight back blindly like the bull. No. Instead, it generates this sort of stinking mess of doubts, questions, and endless overanalysis. What really matters here is what this metaphorical mouse does next. Completely unable to act or even to believe that its own desire for revenge is justified, it just creeps ignominiously back into its dark underground hole. And down there, the crushed, ridiculed mouse just stews in cold, malignant, everlasting spite. He says for 40 years, it'll remember every tiny detail of an injury, and even add new, humiliating, entirely made-up details just to torture itself. His intense consciousness literally paralyzes his ability to act, leaving nothing but this bitter, festering resentment that, bizarrely enough, he actually starts to enjoy. That brings us to Section 3, the illusion of rationality. Defying the statisticians. See, back in his day, philosophers and utopian thinkers were absolutely obsessed with what our narrator sarcastically calls the statistician's register of human advantages. We're talking about things like prosperity, wealth, freedom, and peace. They genuinely believed that if you just enlighten humans to their true, logical, best interests, mankind would magically stop doing bad things. We'd act completely rationally just to achieve these mathematically calculated benefits. Sounds great on paper, right? Well, he throws a massive wrench into this perfect logical machine with one simple, devastating question. What if man desires what is harmful? Think about it. What if a man's true advantage sometimes requires him to want something that actively hurts him? What if human history, which, let's face it, is full of blood and chaos, proves that we really aren't just perfectly logical calculators after all? And that leads us to what he calls the most advantageous advantage. It's one's own, free, unfettered choice and caprice. Basically, it's our absolute, undeniable need for independent choice, even when that choice is totally wild, completely illogical, and directly opposes reason or prosperity. This hidden advantage completely shatters all those rational classifications. Why? Because it proves that humans will always value their free will over their own comfort. Okay, Section 4, Smashing the Stone Wall, the rebellion against mathematical certainty. Take a look at the number 4. For most of us, the formula 2 times 2 makes 4 is just an objective fact. But to the underground man, it's an insolent coxcomb standing in his way with its hands on its hips, demanding total surrender. To him, it represents a reality where human will is totally and utterly irrelevant. He actually calls this inescapable reality the stone wall. This wall represents the absolute laws of nature, natural science, and mathematics. Now, normal men of action actually find this wall morally soothing. They hit the wall of scientific impossibility, they stop, and they feel better knowing they just can't go any further. But the underground man? No way. He refuses to be reconciled to it just because it's a stone wall. He despises the fact that it demands he surrender his individuality, even if he physically lacks the strength to batter it down. This surrender of individuality is perfectly embodied in what he considers his ultimate nightmare, the Crystal Palace. During his time, this was the symbol of the ultimate rational utopia, an indestructible building of pure reason and perfect prosperity. He vehemently attacks his Crystal Palace because, in a mathematically exact society, everything is calculated like a logarithm table. Sure, there's no suffering, but there's also zero freedom. In a perfectly rational building, you wouldn't even be allowed to stick your tongue out on the sly as a joke. You'd literally just be a cog in a flawless machine. Which leads us nicely into Section 5, the value of suffering. This is the paradoxical climax of his whole argument. Our narrator totally rejects the idea that human actions can be mapped out mathematically, reducing us to mere piano keys or organ stops played by the laws of science. He outright refuses to accept a world where everything we do is determined by a calendar and scientific formulas, instead of our own messy, entirely unpredictable human volition. And he takes this to a frantic extreme. He says, listen, even if it were scientifically proven that man was just a piano key, he would purposely do something perverse out of simple ingratitude. He literally argues that humans will intentionally create destruction and chaos, that they'll purposefully go mad just to prove they are men with free will and not predictable math equations. We would literally destroy utopia just to prove we're alive. So here is the crucial, if slightly paradoxical takeaway. Suffering is the sole origin of consciousness. Think about it. The Crystal Palace, that whole utopian ideal, requires the complete elimination of suffering and doubt. But the underground man realizes that suffering is the very thing that keeps us awake, aware, and conscious. Without it, we just plunge into a mindless, robotic existence. He argues that mankind will never renounce real suffering, destruction, and chaos because ultimately it's the absolute proof of our independent existence. Which brings him to his final, bold, and maybe a bit conflicted conclusion. Better conscious inertia. Hurrah for the underground. He declares that he'd much rather sit in his dark, isolated hole, keeping his desires completely unsatisfied and his will totally free, than contribute a single brick to a perfectly rational, pain-free, but completely soulless building. He actively chooses the painful freedom of the underground over the suffocating perfection of utopia. And that leaves all of us with a truly profound, lasting question. If perfect rationality and a life without any suffering meant completely surrendering your independent free will, which would you actually choose? Would you take the calculated, flawless peace of the Crystal Palace, or the messy, painful, but undeniably free existence of the underground? It's a huge dilemma about what it really means to be human. I highly encourage you to explore the source text further to find your own answer. Thank you so much for joining me today on this explainer, and as always, keep learning.